Welcome back, everyone. We now have our panel, A New Era of Agriculture, discussing the future of sustainable agriculture, from geospatial analysis to optimizing farming solutions to indoor farming. And this panel will be moderated by Rachel Payne from FullCycle Climate Partners. Rachel?
Hello and good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. It's a delight to be here. We have an exciting panel ahead for all of you. Today, we'll be talking about a new era of agriculture. I'm Rachel Payne. I am a partner at FullCycle Climate Partners. FullCycle is a growth equity fund that's purpose-built to invest in climate solutions. We invest in companies and their associated climate-critical infrastructure. I come to this from many years working as an impact investor, starting my career on the founding team of Google.org, which was one of the first investment and philanthropic corporate funds. I also founded the Google Africa team, where we worked across sub-Saharan Africa on mobile internet and energy infrastructure. And I served on the board of BRAC, a global NGO that's focused on human development and particularly around women and girls. So with that, I'd like to introduce this illustrious panel. We have a lot of wisdom on this panel today, and I encourage everyone in the audience to think about questions that you'd like to ask towards the end of the discussion. So I'd like to turn over to Dr. Alexis Hoffman. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Can everyone hear me all right? All right. Hi, my name is Alexis Hoffman. I am a data scientist with Jupiter Intelligence, a climate risk analytics company, but I do come from the climate science world. I graduated with my PhD in atmospheric science in 2018, and my dissertation was focused on statistical crop modeling with the hopes of isolating and understanding the impact of climate on yields in sub-Saharan Africa and in the central United States. While at Jupiter, I've worked on a number of projects, including the development of flexible statistical workflows for extreme value analysis and contributions to both the operational and global fire products, as well as advise on a number of climate issues. And I need to partition myself, though, from my agroclimate researcher that I was before I started at Jupiter and what I do now. So while Jupiter does not, well, it does quantify the physical risks associated with climate, and obviously those can affect crop yield and livestock productivity, like extreme drought, flood, et cetera. Jupiter does not currently provide impact assessments that translate that climate shift to agricultural impacts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Dr. Sarah Federman.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everyone for having me. Very excited to be on the panel. So I'm Sarah. I'm a research scientist at Plenty, which is an indoor vertical farm. And what that means is that we grow leafy greens in a completely controlled indoor environment on a vertical plane. So we basically brought the field inside and flipped it on its side for high density, small footprint productivity. My background is in evolutionary biology, so just thinking about how systems are generated and persist sustainably through time. And before Plenty, I was with the USDA working on science technology policy, specifically in the circular carbon economy and indoor agriculture space. So,
Wonderful. Devin.
Hello, sorry, took a second to get the unmute button. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, my name is Devin Desai. I'm currently the head of product at Atlas AI. We are a Series A company that's trying to generate data sets that link between agriculture, infrastructure, and economic livelihood. And these data sets are supposed to basically help make better decisions across a variety of different sectors, but predominantly focusing on emerging markets and frontier markets. Prior to this, I was actually at Planet Labs, the sponsor of this company. So it's convenient that I can just kind of point my finger this way. I was there for about 4 years, and I did a whole bunch of things there, everything from working on internal teams to migrate infrastructure from Google Cloud to AWS to Google Cloud, all the way to eventually moving closer and closer to the customer, kind of working on their emerging markets verticals, focusing on things that are to build high resolution imagery and market it out the door as 50 centimeters, and then also working on a variety of different like verticals such as energy or insurance in order to figure out how to provide remote sensing solutions to there. But yeah, that kind of led me to Atlas AI, and eventually the goal is to make sure that like we can take a variety of information, much like planet data sets, but also a variety of other survey data, financial data, economic data, put it all together so that it results in a decision that needs to be made and can be helped to a variety of causes.
Thank you. Liron, Brish.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Words again, so if it is, don't judge me on that. I'm Liron Brish. I'm VP Product Sustainability at Deveron. Deveron is building a scalable rural workforce to go out into the fields, get our hands dirty, and test for the amount of carbon in the field. Once we do that, we're vertically integrated. We own labs as well as have an insights team that takes those results and provides agronomists basically a hand up in terms of figuring out what is the next best step to take out in their field, not just for carbon, but also sustainability as a whole. I joined Deveron a couple months ago and they acquired my startup called FarmDog. FarmDog was a software platform to help digitize growing agronomist field notes. So that then we can run the data insights on that. And my quick background, law, business, I used to work on fruit and vegetable supply chain, as well as just help companies with their overall tech strategy.
Wonderful. Well, today is a new era in agriculture, as evidenced by many of the trends that we've been seeing, both in the financial landscape as well as in technology developments. There's been quite a transformation. It seems every day we see a new announcement about a SPAC, a reverse merger that allows companies to go public under a new process. And some of these SPACs are quite notable. We have App Harvest, we have Arrow Farms, each of which SPACed for over $1 billion. And we're seeing a lot of investment activity. In fact, there's an estimation that the total addressable market now for indoor farming is around $2 trillion, which is massive. Traditionally, people don't always think about agriculture as highly profitable or innovative, but we're seeing a lot of technology development that's really revolutionizing the space. I'd like to hear from each of you. What are some of the trends that you've seen in this technology transformation that are moving the needle for the industry, but also how they're creating economic value? Feel free to jump in, whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, happy to kind of just kick things off here. I think general trends that have happened is using a variety of different data sets, both sensors in the ground as well as remotely sensed information, aka satellites, has really kind of taken the kind of tip of the spear here, if you will, over the last decade. I think a lot of the processes were already in place. I think a lot of the work that NASA did, for example, in order to generate the data sets that eventually led to indices like NDVI, NDWI, in order to do vegetation and water calculations effectively, those weren't as easily accessible or available to those that actually the end beneficiaries. And so that gap has pretty much closed for the most part in North America and in Europe and large parts of Asia. But for emerging markets, I think it's still definitely a work in progress, but that's the trend that like on the overall that we're seeing, basic operational improvements that can be made with remotely sensed data. Of course, there's a ton of other things that like folks like Alexis and stuff have been working on, but at least at the baseline, that's definitely been the case.
Yeah, I'll add in on that. Data collection and data access is obviously moving the needle, just not only in like the tech space, but also the ag tech space. And the other part of it is computing power. With the flexibility of having, AWS and just flexible compute systems, it's really enabled us to do bigger computations and move those kind of like containers around. And it's really helping us model different systems in an easier way that it wasn't really available to people without supercomputers. So that's one of the things that's definitely helped as well.
Yeah, what I've been seeing, I'll talk about kind of from the grower agronomist level, that they're just digitizing. Mm-hmm. It's still about 70% of growers and agronomists are using pen and paper, but if you ask them 3 years ago, that number would probably be 85-90% are using pen and paper. And so I agree with what everybody's been saying. The access to these data layers is readily available, but there's a delay between the access and the use of it. And what I'm seeing is that agronomists are at least becoming more comfortable just using a simple app. And the expectation is that eventually these data layers are going to catch up to that use.
I would say on a more granular scale, which is what we do in our farm, bringing all of that technology together into a platform and kind of creating looking at farming and agriculture as more of a technology product or platform that's transferable and translatable to different areas, and being able to, like, agnostic of crop, really think about agriculture more holistically. That's the really exciting trend that I've been seeing lately, this melding of agronomy, plant science, and engineering.
I definitely think that that's one of the most exciting areas. And, let's go into this a little bit deeper when we think about, grounding the conversation in soil. Liron, what are some of the great advancements that have been made in terms of being able to understand soil analytics? And how do we, moving up from there, how do we understand different varieties, breeds, and how seeds fit into this equation, and some of the local concerns around that?
Yeah, so the interesting part about this is that a lot of things that we're pushing folks to do from a regenerative agriculture perspective are things that some farmers have been doing for hundreds of years, right? If you look at kind of the cover crop rotation, all these things, and now we're telling folks, hey, do this and you'll have higher yields. Folks have been doing that. We moved away from that for a very long time because mechanization and chemicals and all that, and we're coming back to it, which is great. So that's, I think, number one is, so I wouldn't even say that it's new things, it's just a rediscovery of them. Alongside with that, an important part is growers being monetized or financially compensated for that change, right? Because that was always a problem. 10 years ago, yes, you could be a regenerative ag grower, but you're gonna be selling this for the same amount as anybody, that potato is gonna be worth the same amount as another potato. And so now we're starting to see, it initially started kind of with the hippie markets and getting organic food, right? And now you go to 7-Eleven and you can get organic food or regenerative ag food there. And it's going to keep expanding and really trying to figure out how to create this actual financial market. I sit on the task force for voluntary carbon markets, and we're trying to figure out essentially how do we monetize this in a way so it doesn't collapse, and making sure that we can validate what growers are doing. So there's that aspect, and there's lots of companies going in, and more importantly, I think lots of government incentives. The new Biden plan is actually trying to open up a carbon bank to get this. And so for me, it's rediscovery of things that folks already knew, combined with that financial incentive to utilize that knowledge that we had.
Devin, I want to turn to you because of your work with farmers and helping them understand some of the regional considerations in their practices.
Yeah, so I'd say one part of this starts with the soil and just making sure that's good to go, the practices are good to go. So a lot of the work that Liron's been doing, I think, kind of focuses on that part. The other side of it is the inputs that actually go in, right? So when I say that, I don't even mean broadly just like pesticides or anything else, but just let's start with the seed. Certain seed varieties will just grow a lot better in certain locations than other places, basically, right? So you want to make sure that like you are able to better comprehensively understand the agro-eco regions. There's coordination efforts that are put at like both a national, maybe even a regional level to better understand what's going on. At least in Africa, there's a variety of institutions like One Acre Fund that try to do like collective purchases of inputs and are actually trying to direct them and target them in the right locations. And when that happens, you can basically see that like staple productivity goes up like dramatically because you're getting the right kind of seed to that right particular agro-eco region, as it's called. So just coordination that happens not just at the individual farmer level, but also like across the board can actually help just generate like a lot better and tighter food security mechanism.
And Sarah, with Plenty, I'm sure you've seen so much R&D and innovation around crop varieties for indoor farming.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've screened over 900 varieties of leafy greens at this point. And really, by bringing crops indoors, we can focus more on those consumer-driven traits such as flavor and nutrition. We don't have to worry as much about pest resistance or pathology resistance. So our screening process is very focused on shelf life, nutrition, quality, and we can optimize our grow environment to really ensure consistency. So kind of the other side of what Devin and Liron were talking about is kind of controlling this environment and ensuring that it is remaining consistent and that we are driving quality throughout the entire process.
It's
unfortunately, as I say, unfortunately, satellites won't be able to look through buildings just yet.
Yeah.
Actually, speaking of challenges in data, Alexis, agriculture's come a long way, hasn't it? And what's been a major breakthrough in your work, but also where are some of the challenges still?
Right. So related to what Devin was talking about, agro-ecoregions are a major area of interest for statistical modelers and process-based crop modelers. Just trying to understand how climate change is going to shift optimal growing regions. A lot of the work that I did that focused on the central United States is in agreement with a lot of the other work in the central United States, basically telling us that the optimal growing regions for corn and soybean are going to shift northward. And, that is not necessarily and that's due to, increasing temperatures and more drought-like conditions, et cetera. But that's not necessarily a bad thing if we know it's coming. Mm-hmm. You can buy the appropriate seeds for, and just adjust. And that's, the goal of studying the climate and studying how these types of things are going to change in the future.
Well, this is obviously the meta theme of the day, which is climate risk. And as FullCycle, we're a climate fund, so we're investing primarily in carbon dioxide abatement. And also we look at mitigation from the standpoint of short-lived climate pollutants, so the most harmful greenhouse gases. There's a lot of problems with fertilizer, nitrous oxide. There's a lot of problems with waste in the food value chain. There's estimates that up to 40% of leafy greens are wasted in transport. The shelf life is affected, even the quality and the nutrition levels. When we think about the food mile, and how shipping itself creates a lot of harmful emissions and can dramatically affect the carbon footprint of any crop. I'd like to hear how each of you in your respective roles are addressing the climate challenge, of course, from a risk standpoint, but also in terms of proactively, what are you doing on climate solutions?
So I'll start. So Jupiter Intelligence, the company that I work for, we are a climate risk analytics firm. Our entire foundation is based upon understanding how the climate is changing and what those risks mean to our customers. So there's that. Our whole objective is informing people what their risks are going to be. Whether that's agriculturally focused or not, that's sort of our entire objective. But from an environmental standpoint, obviously we hope to inform people so that maybe they can be nudged in the right direction to do what we consider the right thing or the environmentally responsible thing.
Mm-hmm. And do you have an example of how a nudge has worked? Sometimes data can play a very compelling role, but occasionally it needs to be combined with carrots or sticks or even other types of motivators. So I'm just curious how you found this applied.
Sure. So one of the customers that we've had was Hawaiian Electric, and they have a particular situation whenever there are non-trade winds that are particularly intense, it ruins their utility grid. It basically, there must be some trees in the way that blow into the wires or something, but, and they wanted to know whether that risk was changing. And so we informed them, whatever the climate model said, I can't actually remember at the time, but I believe the risk of extreme events in those non-trade wind directions were increasing. And that leads them to either decide, to maybe move those power lines underground, or at least, address treatment for those trees that are possibly blowing into that. So it's kind of those types of things, like maybe making their grid a little bit more resilient based on the climate risk. Mm-hmm. So not focused on ag, sorry, but
yeah. And Devin, when we think about the farmers that are on the front lines and who are really the ones who are most likely to suffer with the least ability to absorb risk, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, smallholder and medium-sized farms. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'd probably break this into three distinct groups of people. You've got smallholder farmers that are probably in charge of one tiny field, that are operating in a very decentralized fashion, just kind of independently for their own subsistence, and then probably a little bit more on top of that, maybe, right? You've got like medium-sized farming operations or cooperatives that are happening as well. I'd say historically in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot more of those. And then for political reasons, I think they got broken up, and also for lack of trust. Slowly, some of them are coming back together, but they're channeled towards like one type of crop like cocoa or rice or maize or something like that. And then you've got the large, big, operations that are probably as common as what you see in the United States, with like more, like equipment that's autonomous and all that fun stuff. You can imagine most of that last category is probably operating a little bit in Egypt, a little bit in South Africa, a little bit in a few small pocketed areas here and there. Most of what you see is in the first two buckets, right? So the ability to just get information down to the end user for the smallholder farmer sometimes becomes a challenge. I think what we've been noticing is a lot of telco providers are coming up with their own AgTech solution, either working with institutions that can do the geospatial analysis, and then all they're doing is the distribution of information. Hey, seed available for 30% discount, and this is the seed you need. Or hey, start like tilling today, right? Like I'm giving simple examples, but like, just making sure the information disseminates in a meaningful manner is done. There's lots of small startups. I think one of the ones that we sometimes partner with is called Plantix. Their job is entirely to kind of figure out like, okay, from a pest resistance standpoint, can we use computer vision of like smartphone-based photos that are taken inside the field of different issues that have occurred in order to offer a solution or something like that, right? But really kind of the best place to make the most like impact is on that middle space, right? That's kind of where productivity is happening for the most part. That's kind of what is bringing or channeling wealth into a particular community. That's where you see consumption numbers, economically speaking, go up. That's kind of where you actually are able to grow asset wealth, because now that particular farmer can expand into livestock farming, into regular, just like subsistence farming, as well as a few other things here and there. They could grow bamboo on the side as a savings product and then sell that bamboo for a variety of reasons, one way or another. So we're noticing a lot of that activity happening in Kenya as well. So there's always going to be a mixed way to do it, but fundamentally, we look at it in a combination of infrastructure that needs to be built out to support any of this stuff, roads, electricity, whatever. We look at it in a way that like agricultural practices and of course some technology enabled things need to be done. And the last bit is like, how is it actually whether it's causal inference or whether it's anything else, supporting or impacting economic livelihood. And I know you can't really see my hands right now because they're going in and out, but the whole point is like the nexus at that point is really where like we try to do most of our work. And climate is a big part, but like it's really about resilience and economic security.
Yeah, so this is, again, an adaptation resilience opportunity. Interesting you mentioned the telcos. In 2008, I worked with MTN, which you probably know is the largest telecom carrier in Africa. And we launched a series of mobile services for farmers, including agriculture tips and Trader, which is giving farmers access to new markets in order to increase their margins. And we saw a lot of great activity around that. And I do think information is key. Actionable information is even better. And making this data digestible and actionable is part of the work that needs to be done in order to create broader based access to high value information and services generally. And of course, because resiliency very much depends on their ability to make decisions, this brings up one of the exciting areas in this industry, which is how artificial intelligence and data are leading to better decisioning opportunities. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Sarah. How do you use that in your work at Plenty? And related to this theme around climate, how does Plenty help address things like food security and food sovereignty?
Absolutely. So, just to bring it back a little, solving these problems with the food, energy, water nexus is going to take incredible cross-functional communication and collaboration. And I think, coming at it from a remote sensing and big data and resilience perspective is equally as important as coming at it from what Plenty brings to the table, which is thinking about local production and kind of promoting food sovereignty, one city and one food region at a time. So what we do is we really address land scarcity. We address kind of convoluted supply chains, and we address climate resilience by ensuring that our crops can grow in a climate well, we're climate agnostic. We create our own environment so we can grow anywhere that there is energy, water, and people to work the farm with us. And that kind of allows us a lot of flexibility in a world where there is decreasing arable land. So the American Farmland Trust is estimating that we're losing about 3 acres of farmland every minute. So not only are we going to have to really increase our agricultural productivity to feed the future, but we're going to have to do it in less space. And with indoor farming, we can have incredibly high outputs on a very small footprint, and we can have those outputs proximate to our consumers. So this is another way that we're trying to address climate change and create more resilient food supplies, is by delivering directly to our customers. And by doing that, we are ensuring resilient supply, but we're also ensuring that we're wasting less food because we're losing less due to spoilage and shrink. So when we're, as you were saying, when we're moving greens from Salinas and Yuma to New York or Chicago, we're losing upwards of 30% just through that movement process. And so by delivering locally and within a day or two of production, we can really cut down on that waste. And the way that we leverage data and AI is that we're constantly monitoring our grow system and learning with every cycle. And we have so many more cycles in our continuous production system than we do in the field. So we're just constantly learning from our plants and improving through statistical process control.
Liron, Farm Dog, and now your work with Deveron relates very much to helping empower farmers with data. And you mentioned your dashboard. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing there and some of its implications on the climate issue?
Yeah, so we actually start from much more simple data sets than I think everybody else on the panel is working with. We start with the simple field observation records that our agronomists or growers are going out into the field and saying, looking for whiteflies, okay, medium severity, and that's it, right? And so we're not at that billions of data points aspect of big data, but what we have learned is that this data set, which is essentially the primary data set that these folks need to have in order to make decisions or make actionable decisions that continue to improve year over year, isn't available to them today, because it's either sitting in an email, a text message, sometimes a handwritten note that the agronomist goes and places on the desk of the person they're talking to, or a voice message or whatever it may be. And so we start from there and building out this foundational database that, when we first started, it took us a bit of time to be able to say anything smart. Now what we're able to do in certain areas that we are active in is, so for example, we work with the University of Arkansas Extension System. About 50 or 60 of their agronomists enter data into FarmDog. We're able to see and help them understand what is going on a statewide basis. So we start from there. We're not at that point where we say, okay, based off of that specific plant, this is what you need to do. And we're not trying to get there at this point. It's really just creating that digital record. And so now at Deveron, where we focus much more on the soil aspect, you see a very similar thing from soil health. So everybody's talking about carbon markets and, okay, we got to build a baseline of your carbon in order to potentially get paid for it in the future. If you go talk with many growers, they'll say, yeah, I did a soil test a few years ago and a few years before that, and I'm not sure where my results are. I'm not sure where it is. And if we're going to empower these folks to be an ally and be an active partner in using soil to sequester carbon and then to help us all, live a wonderful, bountiful life, we need to empower them with that digital data. And so if you look at that big data aspect, what is it? Descriptive data, predictive data, and prescriptive data. We're very much playing on that descriptive data side of things to just give people what they need to make decisions. Over time, of course, we want to move up that ladder. We've started moving into the predictive data aspect, but I think outdoor crop growing is very complex, as everybody here on the panel can know. And even if we put in 1,000 data sets, data layers, there's still going to be 50,000 that we don't know about. And so for us, it's really, okay, grower, okay, agronomist, here's a way to make sense of what we have pulled in. Now you're the last mile decision making, because you're the one that's been out there and knows what's going on.
And related to that then, Liron, how are you thinking about climate risk in the way that you're empowering farmers,
Yeah.
both in their planning and in their decision-making, of course, in their procurement?
Yeah, so there's a few things. I think Alexis also touched on it about, hey, your growing regions are going to change, right? What we're growing here today is not necessarily what's going to be good to grow 10 miles north of here next year, whatever it may be. And to give an example, we've got some users in Thailand that initially they were using seeds that were optimized for central US, right? And turns out they don't grow that well in Thailand, right? Like it's slightly different. And so there's an aspect of just connecting the dots for them. I'll give you another example. One of our users who's been using us for about 4 years now grows strawberries in Central California. So it's the same user, same field, same pest, spider mites, same pesticide that they've applied, anthracite, and they're just applying it over and over and over again on the fields. By virtue of the data that we collect, again, very simple data, low, medium, high on the spider mite severity scale, and comparing what that severity was pre and post application, we can now see what that hyperlocal efficacy looks like. And we saw that one field literally across the road from another one worked 20% of the time, and the other field worked about 80% of the time. And so we're able to start raising these red flags. If you expand that out, not just from, hey, here are 4 fields across the street from each other, but expand that out to the region, expand that out to the state level, whatever it may be, we can start to see some of these differences on the efficacy or yield potential, the efficacy of treatments, whatever it may be, and see those change over time. And so for us, it's really about giving our users those insights to say, wait a second, something here is not as it used to be, let's adjust.
Mm-hmm. On the climate front, so my firm FullCycle recently made an investment in an indoor container farm complex called Sustainatech. And one of the advantages, similar to what Sarah was saying, is that you're able to now grow in regions that were previously inhospitable to agriculture. You also have this envelope that protects the crops, but it enables automation and sensing and a lot of other remote operations, which are quite exciting and have revolutionized the farming process. On that front, how have you seen automation and robotics transform business operations? And what are some of the implications for labor?
I can kick this off. So I think you laid it out really nicely, Rachel, in that we are very much automating from seeding through harvest all of our production and operations processes. So in a perfect world, the first person to touch our greens is going to be the consumer. Right now we're still an R&D production facility, but that is the design for our new production facility that is going up in Compton, LA this year. So what this automation has allowed us to do is create food safe farming platforms rather than food safe product. And this allows us to be pesticide free. It allows us to be no need to wash. So because we don't use pesticides and because we have very little contact with our plants, that means that you can just pop them right into your mouth like candy, and they are pretty delicious without having to rinse them off. What this means for labor is that as we're continuous production, because we have this kind of bespoke climate envelope that we control, we are creating highly skilled tech jobs that are employing people year round rather than a more ephemeral workforce. So we really are investing in our farm operations and hoping for kind of a long-term relationship.
In some cases, the labor conditions are improved. As I mentioned with Sustainatech, now the environment is much more, it's safer, and there's less exposure to the sun, and they're getting trained on higher skill development. So there's a lot of opportunities here from a labor force standpoint. What are your thoughts about automation and robotics, Devon?
Yeah, so automation and robotics are interesting. I'd say when I talked about the 3 buckets before, Most of the non-indoor farming robotics, if you will, is just entirely on field automation. When we entirely focus on sub-Saharan Africa or just Africa writ large, our expectation is not that the uptake of that equipment will actually happen dramatically quickly or anything like that. It might happen for certain types of crops or, for certain types of industries that have a decent enough supply chain to allow for that. But for the most part, it's still going to be very people heavy. A decent chunk of a population in sub-Saharan Africa for any given country is still like in the agrarian space and in the agricultural space. Like even if you have that, that's still a ton of people that are still involved on a day-to-day basis in agricultural work of some kind. Like I said, either for subsistence or for that. So to me, I view automation purely as a way to talk about getting information to people a lot faster, and hopefully allowing that to be one element of like information that they use in order to make a better decision. Like imagine if like the soil quality assessments from the ground plus the actual understanding of like what's happening climatologically over the last 2 growing seasons was able to be combined into an easy to understand sentence for a farmer at the beginning of the particular growing cycle, in the middle of it, and also like when you should actually be potentially thinking about harvesting. The most interesting example I can give actually is not even in Africa, right? But it's one of our designers at Atlas. He used to work for Ola Cabs, which is the Uber, I suppose, of India. And a lot of weird things started happening when they were thinking about like service revenue over the course of a year or something like that. And what they noticed were a lot of drivers would just go offline at very predictable parts of the year. And they had no idea what was going on until a bunch of these designers and UX people went into the Ola Cabs parking lot to ask the drivers. They're like, yeah, it's because I got to go back to my farm and do the harvesting. And I'm not going to drive in the city while I'm doing that because that's more important. This is my side hustle. And of course, like unless you talk to the actual drivers who are also the ones that might be doing farming work in the peri-urban areas of any given city, like you're not going to know that. So what I think of as automation is when you provide that kind of information, what if that driver knew that on this particular day, you should probably go back to your farm, or you should expect to do harvest on this particular day, or tilling practices are good in this window opportunity right here, then they can actually optimize the rest of their life, whether it's, making sure their children can go to school or something, whatever the, second order or third order effects are. That's how I view automation in a macro lens. Direct farming practices, at least in sub-Saharan Africa or emerging markets, will still be very, I think, human oriented. And that probably won't happen anytime soon until, of course, plenty comes to invade. Totally
Alexis,
joking. Totally
so much of your work, Alexis, revolves around data that informs decision making. How do you think about this topic?
I'm usually in the camp that more data is better. I just like to throw data at problems. So just having more sensors out there, having more data, layering those data in some sort of informative metric for people is just so it's happening at such a rapid scale, or such a rapid rate, and such a huge scale. One of the things that I am most interested in is sort of just automated, like remotely sensed information to help people make decisions and to help monitor their fields. One of the most interesting things I read about recently is actually a sensor that's placed into beehives. I think it's called Apis Protect, and they basically monitor like the hum of, and as well as like the conditions like relative humidity and temperature inside the hives. Because if you don't want to disturb one of your systems, you just don't. So when you find out that something is wrong, then you go and say, hey, what's wrong with this particular hive? Should we intervene? And that's sort of where the expertise comes in. But the monitoring is going to allow you to leave a lot of your hives or your whatever system you're concerned with undisturbed for the most part, which is usually when plants and natural systems do their best work. And then on top of that, and this might relate to what Farm Dog and Deveron do, but drone identification of pests can highly impact the environmental impact of your farm. If you can identify a beetle on a tiny little patch of your field, then you can just do a spot treatment rather than a full overlay of whatever pesticide that you want. And so that impact is going to, and the increase in those systems is definitely going to decrease the environmental impact of a lot of large scale farms.
That's an excellent point. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to talk about the role that AI can play in managing bad actors in a system. How do you use drones and imagery and other sensing technologies to account for those entities that perhaps aren't being very responsible? Sarah, any thoughts there?
Just to echo Alexis, I mean, this is a space where you really want to be throwing data at the problem. So, you know, we've been monitoring our plants for quality, for disease pressure, and we really understand now what it means when we have, say, a temperature rise in our root zone. We know, that there is an increased risk of pathogen susceptibility, and we know how to respond. Similarly, we can image our roots, and we know, at transplant, what the root density means for that cohort's plant health, and how that could in turn impact yield. So those are just a couple of examples about how we leverage data and AI kind of throughout the process to enable decisioning to promote plant health.
So getting back to the question of other actors in the system, Liron, you mentioned water usage and whether or not the water that farmers are using has nitrogen in it. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the metrics that you use around sustainability, ESG, some of the co-benefits, and where and how we might be able to spot some of these bad actors?
Yeah, so I'll reframe it a little bit. On the farm dog and Deveron side, we don't define who a bad actor is, right? I don't know what's going on in this specific farmer's field. Maybe she had to do something specific in order to save the crop that year. What we are able to do, though, is to track our users' activity so that if somebody that the grower is selling into says, hey, prove to me that, we can do that. And so show me that, maybe there's nitrogen runoff in your water, but show me that you looked at weather information before you applied fertilizer in your field. Show me that you looked to make sure that wind speed was under 15 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour before you went out and applied pesticide. And from our perspective, it's more about, did that user take the reasonable steps when they made that decision, as opposed to just, hey, let's take a look at that outcome. And so for us, that's really important, because it takes me back to, the multiple data layers, and we're never going to be able to see everything. No matter how amazing we are, we're never going to be able to see everything. This one specific seed may have been optimized by a researcher at Bayer, a university, in that research plot in that area. The second you move it 50 miles west, everything's out the window. And so for us, it's about the activities, and did that person take the reasonable steps? And then does that user want to share those steps with who they're selling it to, right? And that also, it brings me back to, for all of this to work and for any of this to be fully adopted, right? We've all been through the early adopter phase. We're kind of moving through the, whatever the next one is. For it to really get into that critical mass of users, it's going to have to come from the consumer, which essentially is going to have to come from the CPG companies or the commodity groups that demand this sort of information from them. And so that's how we look at it. We can see activities. We are not saying you're a bad actor, you're a good actor. Who knows? But you do, as one of our users, you have that at your fingertips to utilize.
Well, transparency is what I'm hearing here. There's
Yep.
a theme of
Exactly.
having more transparency, traceability. I see both Alexis and Devin nodding. Would you like to weigh in here?
Sure. I related to the nitrogen point that you brought up, if you have observations of nitrogen in the water in a nearby source, and you are able to run a fully dynamic watershed model, which obviously has a lot of other inputs, then you can technically do a point source identification of someone who maybe lied a little bit on how much nitrogen they applied to their field. You can trace it back and identify not necessarily a bad actor, but someone who might have, stretched the truth a little bit. But on top of that, where AI and data come in is, if we could build an emulator of that model so that we could run it faster and maybe even with more accuracy, depending on what, approach we take, that could really help a situation. And then on top of that, just the whole transparency and identifying people who are maybe not telling the truth, people being corporations. There's been a lot of movement on identifying emitters of greenhouse gases. That's like companies like Carbon Trace, which I think won the Time 100 list last year, and then Carbon Mapper, which is other side, sorry, Planet, just won that contract, I think yesterday, maybe. A lot of people are just trying to keep people in check or keep corporations in check and making sure that what they're doing is transparent and hopefully defensible in some capacity.
Devin, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say I'm merely an observer in this space more than anything. Bad actors gets really interesting to define, if you will, when you're in like the emerging market space. You have people sometimes that what we might consider make bad decisions just because that's the only way that they could have actually made it work for themselves. But then obviously there's the other side of it, which is like they weren't able to make better decisions because they didn't have either the tools or the actual economic security to do so. And so not doing anything might be something we consider as bad acting or being a bad actor, but that's just, yeah. So in general, I would say observationally speaking, at the macro level, it's sometimes difficult to work with certain countries in order to kind of improve what the policy process might be in order to help individual sectors in the ag space. Okay, are you trying to export more maize out of your thing? Okay, you probably want to do these things, right? Please make sure you don't just over subsidize the other side of the equation. Please make sure you move subsidies this way or something like that. Oh, you want to guarantee an actual bank and storage situation. And when I say bank, I don't mean money bank. I mean a grain bank. Make sure you do that so that markets are stable or something like that. I imagine that part of the equation is more important to solve than individually policing individual actors. I think when you get to the smallholder level, you really can't control for that in any way. So I would say I'm more at the observational state, but I am empathizing with a lot of what Liron said earlier, and I'm just yep, very true.
I love how we're jumping from the macro satellite view to the microbial bad actor pathogen view very fluidly. So well done, team. Devin, you actually created a great bridge to another topic related, and it's something that none of you have explicitly said yet, but many of you have a strong policy background as well. And when we think about USDA or some of the work that's being done in the carbon markets or work that's being done to support farmers in various countries, what are some of the opportunities you think for policy to play a role in supporting more sustainable agriculture, more equitable agriculture, and better sustainability practices across the board?
I'll jump on that one. I think it plays a huge role because I think a lot of the issues that we're facing today were created by policy. Without naming certain states, 100 years ago, the U.S. government was promoting the beginning of agriculture in areas where it's just really expensive to grow, whether it's because we got to pipe up a bunch of water to get there, whether it's because conditions aren't, you've got a 2-month growing season, so you got to pump those fields with essentially steroids, whether it's fertilizer or pesticides, to make it happen. And so we've created, speaking US specific, we've created areas where, from a comparative advantage perspective, and so it's all about changing those incentives around, those policies around, to align with what we want to do, right? 100 years ago, I'm not blaming anybody from 100 years ago, we were trying to build out our manifest destiny, right? That was the understood goal of what we're doing. Today, that's no longer the goal, and so these incentives have to change. It's just about changing that policy to get us where we want to, because if we don't change the policy, the end of the day doesn't hit the pocketbook of the grower in the right way, and thus there's no reason for that grower to change. That's simple fact. People got to feed their family, money talks, and policy is what's going to change that.
One thing I want to acknowledge, when you said earlier that we're rediscovering traditional methods of agriculture, I would want to call out here that, indigenous communities across this country and the world were maintaining sustainable practices and tending the wild in ways that were in harmony with nature. And regenerative agriculture tries to get back to some of these, the diversity of crops and the multi-cropping, intercropping methods that can improve soil health. And where I see a lot of opportunity in California, especially with some of the recent policy discussion around regenerative agriculture and soil practices, I do see some of those incentives and an opportunity to accelerate. I wish that the acceleration was happening much more consistently at a federal level and of course at a global level. But I do want to acknowledge that, everything from even, controlled burn in forests, there's a lot of practices that we could and should have learned a long time ago. And so these aren't new, but hopefully we're acknowledging the wisdom that came before, and we're building policy frameworks around sustainable farming that does benefit from some of that knowledge. What else are you guys thinking in terms of policy?
Just to piggyback on Liron's comment, I think on top of those incentives, we really need to do that foundational work to get broad federal and state alignment on standards, what standards and goal setting, because I think that really promotes innovation. And we've seen this time and time again. I think the Clean Air Act did a great job in promoting innovation in car design. There's a very clear A/B, right? And I'd really like to see that for agriculture. On a more granular level, I think, in this past Farm Bill, the Senate appropriated funding for AgArta, which is an advanced research arm of the USDA that would be similar to ARPA-E or DARPA. I think that would be fantastic and transformative for agricultural research and innovation, especially climate smart ag. So I'd be very excited to see that funding come through and to see that office stood up.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I'll just add it from a very macro level. When I did some of the research on sub-Saharan Africa and even in the central United States, in addition to the climate impacts, the technology impact, so the impact of, incentives, seed design, and, fertilizer applications, just learning more about the area, it always came out as being more important than the climate. So if we can keep, innovating and making sure that we're learning and implementing all of those things, I think we'll be in good shape.
I think one thing to add to that's kind of what's always jumping around in my mind that maybe somebody here can help me figure out. So, one of the challenges here is, and we also risk not dealing with anything else. And so carbon and soil, we go with no-till, right? That's what we say, don't touch the soil, nothing. But then oftentimes that results in an increase in herbicides used. And so now there's this, there's no wrong answer, right? But it's okay, let's help with carbon, but whoops, now we've got a bunch of herbicides, and then you go down the glyphosate rabbit hole. And I think that's one thing that we have to make sure is, from a policy making, is everybody's thinking carbon, climate change, obviously obviously we need to think about that for the right reasons. I'm not saying that's not the right thing to talk about, but we need to make sure that we take into account all the potential co-benefits as well as the co-risks alongside having just that one target that we're all shooting for.
Devin, anything to add here?
Yeah, I think for the most part, like what Alexis and Sarah mentioned is kind of the exciting stuff. We've worked with DARPA in the past on a whole bunch of food security measures, and especially when the locust issue started happening in Africa last year.
Yeah.
It'd be really cool to see like an ag version of DARPA, or what did you say it was, Sarah? Like ARPA ag?
AgArta is
AgArta. Yeah, like that sounds phenomenal and fantastic, right? Like I think a big part of the work that we currently do with like the NSF, for example, is a lot around that. A big part of like the large scale activities we try to do with some country offices with the World Bank, especially the 50 by 2030 initiative, where we're trying to get 50 nations to get a whole variety of different data sets, and also just like both from a metric standpoint and an improvement standpoint up to snuff by 2030. It's a pretty audacious goal. So we're like super like excited to be a part of a lot of these things, but to have more of them, it's just awesome, and we'd look forward to it.
Yes, I think we're all in agreement on that. That's exciting to hear. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. So I'd like to close this out with sort of a rapid fire round where each of us shares either something that we want to raise awareness around, a call to action or an aspiration, or even just a vision of the future of ag that you'd like to share with everyone. Let's start with Liron.
Yeah, so my big thing is that environmental sustainability has to come together with financial sustainability as well as social sustainability. It's a triangle that each one affects the other one, and we can't be successful with one in isolation. All three have to move together.
Wonderful. Sarah.
I want to see a prioritization of sustainable and accessible food systems. So that's kind of my exciting goal.
Devin.
Sorry, I wasn't able to press the mute button quick enough. I'd say for the most part, it's about making sure we can get economic livelihoods up in emerging and frontier markets. There is no space like ag to be able to make the largest dent there. So to be a part of that's just awesome.
And Alexis.
Okay, I think mine's twofold. So I come at it from the data and the science perspective. So first, if we can get more labeled data sets, more digitized data, that can obviously help inform a lot of decisions and a lot of models that we generate. And then from a physical climate risk aspect, if we can understand those risks ahead of time, we can plan for them and mitigate and adapt our systems, hopefully in a gradual way that will just avoid any sort of like cultural shocks and, violent shocks. And, I think if we know what's coming, we can plan for it and we can try to make it an easier transition.
Excellent. And I would say, because I'm at an investment fund, investing in the transition to a low carbon economy is the greatest investment opportunity of our lifetime. And I'm not sure it's ever been as exciting as it is now to invest in agriculture. So really looking forward to what's ahead for all of you. And thank you so much for a wonderful, informative, and inspiring panel.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.